What if I told you the most famous thing you know about Vikings is a complete lie? That image of a ferocious warrior, horned helmet on his head leaping from a longship. It's powerful, but that horned helmet is pure fiction, a fantasy dreamed up for a 19th century opera. The reality is infinitely more complex and far more interesting. Welcome to 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Jake Sullivan, and today we're uncovering the true story of the Viking Age, a transformative era when the people of Scandinavia erupted onto the world stage and reshaped it forever. They were not just pirates. They were traders, explorers, settlers, and nation-builders whose voyages stretched from North America to Baghdad. So what turned these Scandinavian farmers and fishermen into the terror of Europe? To understand the explosion, we first have to understand the world that forged them. Imagine pre-Viking Scandinavia, a land of stark contrasts. In Norway, you have a jagged coastline of deep fjords and towering mountains, with very little farmable land. Here, the sea wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. Life revolved around the water, breeding generations of expert sailors and shipwrights. To the east, Sweden had vast forests and lakes, its people looking eastward across the Baltic Sea, down the great rivers of modern-day Russia. And then there's Denmark, flatter and more fertile, with a larger population and a strategic position controlling the trade lanes between the North and Baltic Seas. These different environments created distinct strengths. Norwegians became deep-sea navigators, Swedes became riverine traders, and Danes became the great organizers of large-scale ventures. Their society was a rigid pyramid. At the bottom were the thralls, or slaves, who were considered property. Above them was the great majority, the Karls, or freemen, the farmers and landowners who were the backbone of society. At the top were the Jarls, the powerful chieftains and aristocrats, and the many petty kings, whose power depended entirely on their success in war and their generosity to their followers. This society was driven by a few key internal pressures, or push factors. Population was likely growing, straining the limited farmland, especially in Norway. Ambitious kings were trying to unite their lands, creating a class of defeated rivals and independent chieftains who preferred exile to submission. And inheritance laws often left younger sons with no land and no prospects. For these ambitious, landless young men, going a Viking was a high-risk, high-reward career path to wealth and status. But the final, crucial piece of the puzzle was a technological masterpiece, the Longship. For centuries, Scandinavians had been perfecting their clinker-built ships, where overlapping hull planks were riveted together, creating a vessel that was both incredibly strong and flexible. Sometime in the 8th century, they added a mast and a large square sail to this design. The result was a ship that was a marvel of engineering. It was fast under sail, or oar. Its shallow draft meant it could sail up rivers deep into enemy territory and land on any gently sloping beach, making ports unnecessary. It gave the Norsemen a tactical mobility their enemies simply could not match. They had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. The pull factor was the immense, and poorly defended, wealth of Europe. The kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons and the great Carolingian Empire were filled with treasure, much of it concentrated in coastal monasteries that were perfect, undefended targets. By the late 700s, the spring was coiled tight, and on the 8th of June, 793, it finally uncoiled. The target was the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of England. It was one of the most sacred sites in Britain, a center of learning and art, and it was filled with gold and silver treasures. It was also completely unprotected. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with pure horror, saying the raiding of heathen men miserably devastated God's church in Lindisfarne Island by looting and slaughter. The news sent a shockwave through the Christian world. The scholar Alcuin wrote, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." For the Vikings, the raid was a stunning success. It proved the vulnerability of these sites and provided the blueprint for an age of plunder. The Viking Age can be broken down into three main phases. The first, from about 793 to 850, was the age of hit-and-run raids. Small fleets would leave Scandinavia in the spring, strike monasteries and coastal towns with lightning speed, grab all the portable wealth and slaves they could, and be home before winter. It was violent, opportunistic entrepreneurship. But around the year 850, the strategy changed. This was the beginning of Phase 2, large-scale armies and settlement. Viking armies became much larger, and instead of going home, they began to stay the winter in fortified camps on enemy soil. The most famous example was the Great Heathen Army that arrived in England in 865. This was a full-scale invasion force, led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Over the next decade, they systematically conquered the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Only the Kingdom of Wessex, led by Alfred the Great, held out. After Alfred's victory at Edington in 878, a treaty established the Danelaw, a vast territory in northern and eastern England, where Danish law held sway and the Viking warriors settled down as farmers and traders. A similar process unfolded in France. After decades of raiding up the Seine River, the French king made a deal in 911 with a Viking leader named Rollo. He granted Rollo a huge territory in exchange for peace and protection from other Vikings. This land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The final phase, from about 980 to 1066, was the age of royal expeditions. The attacks were now state-sponsored invasions, led by the newly powerful kings of a consolidated Scandinavia. The Danish king, Sweyn Forkbeard, conquered all of England in 1013. His son, Canute the Great, ruled a massive North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway. The year 1066 is the traditional end of the age. The king of Norway, Harald Hardrada, a man who was the very archetype of a Viking adventurer, invaded England to claim its throne. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English king Harold Godwinson. This battle is often seen as the last great Viking invasion. Just 3 weeks later, the English king was himself defeated and killed at the Battle of Hastings by another claimant, William, the Duke of Normandy, a direct descendant of the Viking Rollo. The reach of the Vikings was simply breathtaking. While Danes and Norwegians focused on the west, raiding and settling the British Isles and founding cities like Dublin, they also pushed out into the empty ocean. They settled Iceland around 874, establishing a unique republic governed by a national assembly called the Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament. From Iceland, Eric the Red led a colonizing expedition to Greenland in 985. And then, around the year 1000, his son, Leif Erikson, sailed west from Greenland and landed in North America. Archaeological proof of this came in 1960, with the discovery of a Norse settlement at Landsay-o-Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The Vikings had reached the Americas almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. While Norwegians and Danes went west, the Swedes looked east. Known as the Rus, or Varangians, they traveled the great rivers of Eastern Europe. They followed the Volga River to the Caspian Sea to trade with the Arab world, exchanging furs and slaves for huge quantities of silver. They followed the Dnieper River down to the Black Sea and the greatest city in the world, Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the Great City. Along these rivers, a Varangian chieftain named Rurik and his successors established a state that became known as the Kievan Rus, the historical ancestor of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Many also served as elite mercenaries in the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguard, the famous Varangian Guard. A bored Viking guard even carved his name, Halfdan, in runes on a marble railing inside the magnificent Hagia Sophia Cathedral, a 1,000-year-old piece of graffiti that says Halfdan was here. The Vikings were not uncultured savages. Their warfare was brutally effective, based around the shield wall, a solid barrier of interlocked shields. Their primary weapons were the spear and the iconic bearded axe. Swords were expensive status symbols. And some of their most feared warriors were the berserkers, who fought in a trance-like fury, supposedly immune to pain. But their artistic culture was vibrant, seen in the complex swirling animal-style patterns that decorated everything from their jewelry to their memorial runestones. They valued poetry and storytelling, and it is thanks to the Icelanders that the great tales of Norse mythology, of Odin, Thor, and Ragnarok were preserved. So why did the Viking Age end? The world simply changed, both inside and outside Scandinavia. The kingdoms of Europe got better at defending themselves. They built navies and fortified towns. The easy targets were gone. More importantly, Scandinavia itself was changing. The kings grew more powerful and suppressed the freelance raiding that had defined the era, and, crucially, Scandinavia converted to Christianity. The old pagan warrior ethos, with its dream of dying in battle to reach Valhalla, was replaced by a new Christian faith. Raiding fellow Christians became a sin. In the lands they settled, the Vikings simply assimilated. The Norse in Normandy became French. The Norse in Ireland became Irish. The Danes in England became English. By the end of the 11th century, the Scandinavian kingdoms had become normal European nations. The Viking had faded into history. The legacy of the Northmen is immense and undeniable. Politically, they created new states like Normandy and the Kievan Rus, while their attacks forced others, like England and France, to centralize and become stronger. Economically, they were the great connectors of their age, weaving a trade network from Canada to Central Asia. And their culture is embedded in our own. The English language is filled with hundreds of their words, including basic ones like sky, leg, egg, and even the pronouns they, them, and their. Their DNA is woven into the gene pool of millions of people across Europe. The Viking Age shows us that the line between raider and trader, destroyer and creator, is often blurry. They were a complex people who, armed with incredible ships and boundless ambition, burst out of their northern homeland and forever changed the world. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know down in the comments below. If you found this interesting or learned something new, please give this video a like and don't forget to subscribe to 10-Minute History for more deep dives. Thanks for listening.